Scripture reading is going to be Genesis 24, 1 through 9. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, See to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, To your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine, only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning this matter.
Good morning. If you want to stick a marker in Genesis 24, that's going to be our text for today, both this morning and tonight. We're going to talk about, it's just one long lesson, but it's too long to do in one thing. So stick your marker there and leave it for both of our services. I'll start with, I got a couple things I want to say to start with, but the first is a welcome. We've got some visitors with us, and we're always glad. Hey, Jordan, welcome home. I'm glad you're here too. It's always good to see people visiting with us, family and loved ones, and welcome. I hope that this time this morning is useful for building up your soul. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to dive into God's Word to worship Him. We're not doing the things, I get great benefit out of it. I know that a lot of our congregation does, but the point is not what I get out of it. We're trying to offer our worship and our praise to God and hear what He has to say. And I hope that you leave here this morning built up in the Lord. And I want to say this starting off. It's uncomfortable and weird. I know that. It always is. I'll give you an example of this. On Thanksgiving and Christmas especially, I know, and on his birthday, I know that Becky's parents are always thinking about Luke. Becky had a brother who passed away in 2001. He was 11 years old, and even, 21 years later down the road, you can see it on their face, and Thanksgiving and Christmas, that they're thinking about their son. And I never know what to say. And often I think to myself, maybe it's best just not to say anything. But then I think, well, that's not good. If you're suffering, you want to at least know that somebody sees and feels. And so I'll say, as uncomfortable as it is, hey, I don't know what to say. But I know that you're hurting today, and I'm feeling with you. And then that's normally the end of it. And it's super awkward and super weird because that's the way I do almost everything. But I always feel like it's best just to say it. I see you, is all. And I start with that this morning because I've spent the last 2 weeks in preparing and thinking about this lesson, knowing that there are some people who are going to sit here through this lesson today who are going to hurt. Both this morning and also tonight. And maybe you will feel it because maybe you're going to see some of the things that we're going to read about in the Bible, and you're going to think, I didn't do that. And here you are, down the road. And maybe you're going to disagree with me. And this is one of the reasons why I want to start with this too. Always, this is not me standing up here preaching a lesson and you go home mad and we never talk again about it. Bring your concerns. Like, let's talk about these things. The things that hurt and that you feel sting, let's talk about it. But Mostly, this is this is me doing the awkward thing that I do for the most part, just saying because I think it's better to acknowledge it from the start. For some of you, maybe there's some of you that I don't even know about, but for some of you, I see you, and I'm not standing up here saying things that I know are hurtful to you, enjoying them, hurting you, or not thinking about the words that I say. I've tried to put extra caution in the way that I say things, knowing that these things are going to be hurtful to some people, and so I just acknowledge that from the start. Open up your Bible, please, with me today, especially because whenever we get to a subject like this that's sensitive and sometimes causes people to feel out of their comfort zone, it's even more important to be in the Bible and to read the text and know that this is not Ryan standing up here spouting off hostile opinions at different people. Read it in your Bible with me. The goal of what I said, and that's why I started the way that I started, the goal of this is to hear what God has said to us. What is the thing that God has said, and to conform our lives as best as we possibly can. Even knowing that many of us have made a lot of mistakes, and we're going to have to live with the consequences of those mistakes, but I'm going to try as best as I can to conform my life to the Word that we study and read about. So that's that this morning. I even mentioned this to a couple people. Maybe we just skip this chapter and not talk about these things. There's two things about that. Number one is we have, and I can't say it strongly enough, outstanding leadership in this congregation. The thing that made the biggest impression on me, I'll never forget this. I even wrote it in my notes, but I don't need it in my notes. I'll never forget this, ever, for as long as I live. There was a sensitive lesson that we talked about several months ago, and I let our shepherds know, hey, this is coming. Maybe we don't stream this one on the internet, just because this is the kind of thing that gets people, kicked off the internet, and we don't desire to have protesters lining up down the street in the church building and all that sort of thing. And I was told, we don't censor the Word of God. And I thought, I will follow you off a cliff whenever I heard that. That's what I want to follow. But on this one also, maybe we should skip this chapter. Hey, this is coming. It's going to sting some people. It's going to sting. We don't censor the Word of God. This is the chapter that we're on. These are the things that we talk about. And so there's another reason. I said there's one thing. There's two things. There's one, our leadership is outstanding. Number two, this is Genesis 24, it's the longest chapter in Genesis. Think about that for a second. Wouldn't you like to know more about creation? Wouldn't you like to know more about Adam and Eve in the garden? Or Noah and the flood? And the story around some of those different things. I'd like to know some of the more deeper details about Abraham and some of the stuff that we read about with Abraham. But Genesis 24 is the spot where God said, I'm going to talk more about this than any other subject in the Bible. That's something we should pay attention to. The longest chapter in Genesis. I said the Bible in Genesis. This is the longest chapter in Genesis with more detail than any of the other stories. And what we're going to talk about is Abraham. Oh, here's another thing worth paying attention to. You want to say this is a really big deal? 24 verses 1 through 9 are Abraham's last words. We're at the end of the road. And you kind of think, a person's last words, that's a big deal. Longest chapter in Genesis, father, patriarch, Abraham's last words, big deal. We're not going to skip Genesis 24. All of that just to say we're not going to move past it. This chapter is Abraham at the end of his life saying to his servant, I need you to find a wife for my son Isaac. And all of the details that go along with that. And so here's what we're looking for. Not only are we reading into this story and saying, what has God said about it? We're trying to extract principles for ourselves about what kind of a person we're looking for to marry and what are some of the criteria that we need to be paying attention to, that God thought was important to put into this story. And so this morning and tonight, we're just going to make a list. Go through Genesis 14. What kinds of things do you see on this list? Some of you might think, I'm already married. I don't need to deal with that. This is important. Stick with me on this. It's important because we're thinking about the generational success of our congregation. We want our kids and our grandkids and even our kids in this congregation to move forward in a way that's good for the Lord. It's good for themselves, it's good for the Lord, it's good for the Lord's people, so it's important. Stick with me on this one, please. Verses 1 through 4. We're going to start with the first point. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things, and Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had. I don't have this one as a point because there's too many points and I've already talked too long, but that probably should be point number 1. Making preparation for these things. Putting trusted people like the oldest servant in your household to take care of this stuff. That should probably be number 1. Number 1 is what we're doing this morning. We're talking about it. We're preparing for the future. We're making arrangements for this sort of thing. And so Abraham says, put your hand under my thigh, verse 3, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. Number 1. Sorry, there's the text. Number 1. Abraham says to his servant, don't take a wife for my son from the people of the land, from the Canaanites that we live among. Go to my family, go to my people. Get a wife for my son from my people. Don't take a wife for my son from the people of the land. Go back to Genesis chapter 22. The end of the story is he finds Rebekah. We've already met Rebekah, and this is why this passage is important. Back in chapter 22, this is where Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. And in verse 20, after these things it was told Abraham, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, and Kesed, Hazo, I don't know these names. Verse 23, Bethuel fathered Rebekah. There she is. I think if you try and pay attention to major characters in the story, you highlight Rebekah's name there because we meet her for the first time. And she's going to be the next Sarah, the next matriarch. If Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are patriarchs, these are the matriarchs. Here's what we're looking at. Here's Terah, here's Abraham, here's Isaac. Abraham has 2 brothers, Nahor and Haran. Remember, Haran died early on. Nahor has Bethuel. Haran has a daughter, Milcah. You can kind of see the family situation here is getting pretty questionable by our standards. Nahor and Milcah have Bethuel. Bethuel has Rebekah. So Abraham says, find a wife for my son from among my people, not from the people of the land. And so the servant comes home with Rebekah, who is descended from both of Abraham's brothers. This is the first thing. I've got 2 objections that I want to talk about in this lesson. And normally, my response to this sort of thing is to blow it off, and I don't, it's kind of like I'm not going to address foolishness. You can do foolishness if you want, but this is what, if somebody wants to object to this lesson, this is the sort of thing that you'll hear people say. Oh, so if we're going to follow this example, you're saying I should marry my cousin then, right? That's what you're saying. It's foolishness. This whole series of lessons has been principles and lessons. And the principle is, without a doubt, in this in this thing that Abraham is talking about. The principle is, don't take a wife for Isaac from among the people of the land where I dwell. Take a daughter for Isaac from my people, from our people, not from the people of the land. That's the principle. You have to see the principle. I think most people can appreciate that. And here's another thing that's really impressive to me as I go through this story. This is the first thing that we know about Rebekah, where she comes from and who she is. Later we're going to talk about all kinds of stuff. She's super impressive. She's industrious. She's a hard worker. She's hospitable. The text says that she's very good looking. It says very, not good looking. It says she's very good looking. In this way, we remember Sarah and some of the stuff that happened with Sarah. She's ready. We'll talk about this tonight. She's ready to take the mantle of being Sarah's next in line, the matriarch. There's all kinds of stuff we're going to talk about with Rebekah. The first thing on the list is who she is and where she comes from. That's worth paying attention to. Don't take a wife for my son Isaac from among the people of the land. I want to dive into a couple different things on this point. Maybe we'll get to three different things, several different passages, but three different things on this point. Number one, we're talking about the marriage, the eventual marriage of Abraham's son Isaac and his wife Rebekah. Let's fast forward in the story just a little bit. Isaac and Rebekah are going to get to experience both sides of this conversation. They're going to have two sons, Jacob and Esau. Look at Genesis chapter 26 and start with me in verses 34 and 35. Genesis 26, 34 and 35. When Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, the people of the land. He took Judith, the daughter of this Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and listen to this, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Jump over to chapter 27, starting in verse 46. Chapter 27, starting in verse 46. I'm going to read down to 28 and verse 2 on this section. Rebekah said to Isaac, I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, there's our principle. The people of the land versus our people. If Jacob marries one of these, what good will my life be to me? 28:1, then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and directed him and said, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. And then he says, go to the same thing. Go to our people. Find a wife from among our people, verses 6 through 9. Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take a wife from there, and that as he blessed him, he directed him, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women, and that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and gone to Padan Aram. So when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please Isaac his father, Esau went to Ishmael. Still not our people. He went to Ishmael and took as his wife, besides the wives he had. Here are a couple of other people. And so I think there's something worth paying attention to in this. At least two things that come to my mind. Number one, it's almost as if Esau wanted to gouge his parents. You blessed Jacob and not me. I know how I'm going to hurt you. And the way that he said, I'm going to gouge you and hurt you, is by marrying from among the people of the land and not from among our people. But a second thing that you can see is it sure didn't end well. I mean, there's no question, there's no debating that in this story. It didn't end well, which is why it didn't end well, part of this. This is embedded within the law of Moses. When God said, here is the law for my people, this is how you walk, this is how you live, it's what you do, it's what you don't do. This is a part of that law. Look at Exodus 34. I do want to take the time to read it. In Exodus chapter 34, in verses 11, I think that's supposed to be 16, observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. Tear down their altars, break down their pillars, cut down their Asherim, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. And when they, the inhabitants of the land, when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited, you participate because you've entered into a covenant with them, a relationship. You've married into their families. They invite you to their sacrifices, and so you participate. 16, and you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods. God specifically said the words, do not do this thing because it's not going to end well. Here's the thing about this. I know it's painful and sensitive and hurtful to talk about these things. I know that it's true. Listen to the words of God. God said, don't do this thing. It's not going to end well. He even tells us what the ending is going to be. Look at Deuteronomy 7. There's one more that we'll look at in the law of Moses. These are not the only two places that you can find this law, but it's important that we see them. Deuteronomy 7 in verses 1 through 5. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering, take possession of, and clears away many nations before you. He names them again, verse 2. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them, show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus you shall deal with them. And God's response with the Exodus situation, when you're going into the land, is completely destroy them. Have nothing to do with them. And it's almost as if he says, if I say completely destroy them, have nothing to do with them, it's like, does he even need to add the extra part of the sentence? And don't marry them, for crying in the night. Don't take them into your family. Don't be married into their families. Don't have anything to do with the people of the land. This is the second objection. The second objection, the first one is, so you're saying we should marry our cousin? Be done with that nonsense. The second objection, but this is the law of Moses. And we're not required by God to live under the law of Moses. We eat bacon. We work on Saturday. We do all of those things because we don't live under the law of Moses. But remember, the class, this lessons through Genesis, are principles and lessons. And Paul even said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he said it twice in this context. He said, in regards to these Old Testament things, they have been written for your instruction. They've been written as examples for you. And so we extract the principle. Nobody's standing up here saying, you must follow and obey the law of Moses. We're saying we extract the principle. And the principle is, when you connect yourself with the people of the land, especially in marriage, there's no stronger connection than that. When you connect yourself with the people of the land, it's not going to end well for you. That's the principle. That's the lesson. And so what I'd like to do, just on this last point, and then we'll move on, is that you can see several examples through the Old Testament. I'm only going to look at 3 of them, where people disobeyed what God said. And you can see, as if we need to be told, he's the creator of the universe, but you can see that it played out exactly as he said it was going to. Chapter 25 of Numbers, verses 1 through 3. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And you continue to read and you see, hey, there's a girl. I think I'd like to marry her. And the next thing that happens is I'm worshiping pagan gods. at least in this story, Judges chapter 3. This is one of the things that God said, don't do for this reason. The children of Israel did it. Judges chapter 3 and verses 5 and 6. The people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Remember the two passages that we read that said, don't do that thing? They did that thing in Judges. They lived among these people, verse 6. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. Remember, it's not going to end well. And you see it happening. And there's some of us, I say us because I'm one of them. There's some of us who hear advice and instruction like this, and we think, no, but not me. I'm immune. Those things aren't going to happen to me. It's different for probably you, definitely not me. How many examples? Like, how many times do we need to read what God said, and how many examples do we need to see? Here's the last one in 1 Kings chapter 11. The reason why I'm in 1 Kings chapter 11 is because this is Solomon. And the thing about Solomon that always strikes me on this one is not only that he's David's son and the guy who built the temple, Solomon has been endowed by God with a dose of wisdom that has been unsurpassed by all other humanity except for Jesus. Super wise guy. And so if anybody is immune, if anybody can rise above this and not be affected, you would think that it's Solomon with all of the things. And remember in Deuteronomy 17, it said kings are not to do boom, 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 boom. Starting in 1 Kings 10 and verse 14, you have a list of how Solomon, it's almost as if he read that list and he said, I'm going to do the opposite of everything God said not to do. And one of the things that he did, starting in verse 1 of chapter 11, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn your heart after other gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses, 300 concubines. Here's highlighted in my Bible. I know you're not surprised to hear that. And his wives turned away his heart. And as bad as you think it might be, it's way worse. Listen. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after the Ashtaroth, the god of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh the He didn't only build a temple to God, the temple to God. He built temples to other gods. Think about that. He built temples, houses for other gods, the gods of his wife. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountains east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifices to their gods. Point number 1. Abraham sends his servant out to find a wife for his son Isaac. And the first thing that he says is, don't get a wife for my son from the people of the land. Get a wife for my son from among our people, not from the people of the land. Here's the lesson. Don't attach yourself to the people of the land, or they will lead you away from God and his promises. I'm not going to read this, but write it down. If you write these things down and study them later, this is a good place to read 2 Corinthians 6 and verses 14 through 16. Do not be unequally yoked. That's where that would fit in. Okay, back to Genesis chapter 24. Let's read verses 5 through 9. I have one more thing to say about this story, and then we'll be done, and we'll come back tonight, and we'll talk about more. Genesis 24 and verse 5. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? You see what his question is? Abraham says to the servant, go and get a wife from my people and bring her back. And he says, got it. It's a good question. What if I find the wife from among your people, but she says, I want to stay here and I don't want to go there? That's his question. It's a good question. Verse 6, Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine, only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. And so you've got principle number 2. Stay in the promised land. Principle number 2, I'll go ahead and throw the lesson up here for you so you can see what I'm going to be talking about as I read through this. Even if somebody is our people, your people, if they don't want to live in the promised land, move on. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because you know this, maybe better than me, probably better than me. I bet you've seen it more than me. How many times have you seen the person who marries somebody, the marriage goes south, maybe it doesn't fall apart, but it goes south for some reason, and the person is just shocked, and they say, but I married a Christian. The Christian part is the least minimum standard. To be from among our people. That's not the only thing. It's not a checkbox where we say, they've been dunked, they're a Christian, they're baptized. What Abraham says to his servant is, yes, find somebody who is among our people, but our people need to want to live in the promised land. To live among our people, to be where God is, to inherit the promises that God has made for us. I'm not going to put any kind of percentage on this. Everybody always gets wound up. How much do you think? We have no way of knowing that sort of thing. But there are all kinds of people who call themselves Christians who live and act as if they don't want to be in the promised land. We see them all around us. And so Abraham says to his servant, under no circumstances, even if this person is from among our people, do not take my son out of the land of promise. She comes to the land of promise. We do not leave and go there. And I have one more thing to say. Look at chapter 24 and verse 33. This is advice. Practical advice. Especially for young people. Well, you don't have to be young people. Especially for people who plan on being married someday. Don't ever say this to somebody. This thing that we're studying and reading from and talking about this morning, this is the stuff we talk about among ourselves. These are the things I talk about with my kids. These are not the things that I guess it is being blasted out to the internet right now, but it's a different conversation why that's happening. But these are not the things that we talk about with other people. And I'll give you some examples of it, but first I want to show you. I want to show you something. It is when the servant made it to the place where Rebekah was, and he begins the negotiations with Laban about whether or not Rebekah is going to marry Isaac and come back with him. The servant does not say this. The servant doesn't say, I would like to take your daughter home with me for my master, Isaac, but if she's not willing to come, all bets are off. He doesn't say that. Read it. Read it carefully. Chapter 24, we'll do verses 33 through 41. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, I will not eat until this is the servant. We got to talk about why I'm here before we sit down and party. Verse 34. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master. He has become great. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male servants, female servants, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old. And to him he has given all that he has. My master made him swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I dwell, but you shall go to my father's house and to my clan, and take a wife for my son. And I said to my master, perhaps the woman will not follow me. Here we are. And he said to me, the Lord before whom I have walked will send his angel with you to prosper your way. You shall take a wife for my son from the clan from my father's hand, and then you will be free from my oath when you come to my clan. If they will not give her to you, you will be free from my oath. It reads very differently from when Abraham was talking to the servant. When he talked to the servant, he said, under no circumstances. If she's going to be my people who marries my son, she's got to come to the promise. She's got to want to live in the land of promise. But it's not as if the servant went to Laban, Bethuel's house, and said, you coming with me or nothing. You don't see it. And then there's even more as you keep reading through the story in verses 55 through 59. Let's read it. I'm almost done, so we'll read it and then wrap it up. 55. Her brother and her mother said, let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that, she may go. So, okay, you can go, but stay for a long time. And we know how Laban operates. Stay for 10 days is not 10 days with Laban. You see later on in the story. But the servant said in verse 56, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. And they said, let us call the young woman and ask her. I think that's super important. Let's hear what she has to say. Let's see what she wants to do. And they called Rebekah and said, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. And so they sent away Rebekah to their sister and nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. Here's a couple things from Victor Hamilton's commentary. The woman, should she not want to go to Canaan, is not to be allowed that option. The servant is not to use coercion if a polite invitation does not succeed. If she doesn't want to go, he's going to go home empty-handed. And this is the thing I want you to hear. Going home empty-handed is better than taking one of your people home who doesn't really want to be there. To him who has ears to hear, let him hear. You see what we're talking about? Listen, here's another part of this. What is being solicited in 57 and 58 is both Rebekah's feeling about leaving and leaving with so short a notice or waiting for a few days. She is being asked not only whether she wants to leave, but also if she wants to leave now or later. And if she would have said no, then the servant would have gone on home and said, sorry, didn't find a wife. So here's the part where we think about this. Don't ever say these things to another person. I can't date you because you're not a Christian. Listen, it doesn't even have to be from the Bible. Anybody with a brain can know what's going to happen in that situation, at least a huge percent of the time. Okay, I'll become a Christian. And now what do you have? Or you're dating somebody who is a Christian, and it's moving along, and you say to this person, you're a Christian, but I can't marry you because you don't want to live in the promised land. You don't live and act as if you want to be with God's people in the promised land and all this. Don't say those things to somebody, because anybody can pretend for 5 minutes, and they will. I can't date you because you're not a Christian, and you are a Christian. I can't marry you because you're not serious about living among God's people in the promised land. I don't want this to go any farther because you're not serious in your faith, or any of these things. Don't ever say these things to somebody. It's a principle that we can take from this. In verse 58, I think there's a really good sign here. They called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with the man? And she said, I will go. And in this, she was like Abraham, willing to leave her people, willing to leave where she was familiar, to go into the place that God had promised him. She said, I'll do it. And the servant was like, I found the one. She's willing. She's our people. She wants to live in the promised land. We're good to go. Chapter 24 and verse 8. This is our summary. Then I'm done. If the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. Don't attach yourself to the people of the land, or they will lead you away from God and his promises. And even if they are your people, move on if they don't want to live in God's promised land. I think my first 2 points tonight are just as long as these, but I'll try and move quick because I don't remember how many I have, but there's a bunch more stuff to learn about what we're looking for, what we need to be teaching our young people and our kids. And so I hope you come back tonight and hear that. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, at the end of every lesson, we offer you an opportunity, and this is the awkward, weird part where I say the things out loud that most people are just like, let's just feel weird about it. I realize that you can hear a lesson like this and look at me, and probably a huge chunk of people in our world will say, wow, that's arrogant. Wow, you're very exclusivistic. That's very, you think you're better than everybody else. That's not true. Everybody in this congregation, we're here because we're saved by the blood of Jesus. All need to be forgiven of their sins and to come to God through Jesus. We don't stand up here and say these things to present or act as if we think that we're better than anybody else. We're not. What we're doing is we're saying, this thing is the top priority in the life of somebody who wants to be one of God's people. And so if you're sitting here and you say, hey, I'm not a Christian, I would like to be a Christian, what we're learning about is that God comes first in the life. These are all of my priorities. This is all of my values and all of my direction in life. This is the thing that's first. And if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian and you're ready to start putting God first, we'd love to help you with that. Come forward now and sing the invitation song as we sing the invitation song.